This is Pamela Smythe from the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on soundcloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 157 of Beyond the Bulletin, originally broadcast on July 14th, 2023. The attack that took place on our main campus on June 28th shook our entire community. It continues to stir up many emotions as we try to process what happened. In his work leading the Whole Family Lab on campus, Dr. Dillon Browne provides support to families, including those who have experienced a traumatic event. He's Canada Research Chair in Child and Family Clinical Psychology and tells us what healing looks like and how we can support ourselves and one another. Thanks for joining me, Dillon.
Thanks for having me.
What is trauma?
So trauma is a term that can be applied in different settings to mean a couple of different things. So very often when we're thinking about trauma, we're thinking about traumatic events. And traumatic events have a particular definition in the psychiatric world. And generally, traumatic events are suggested to include potentially or actually life-threatening circumstances that may involve violence, sexual assault, or some type of disaster. Another definition that exists in the literature is a little less specific, but speaks to events that are either horrific or extremely threatening. It's important to remember that events can be acute, so singular things that happen, such as in the case of a natural disaster or a campus attack, or they can be chronic and persistent. And those are the types of things that we might see in settings of poverty or community violence that is ongoing. Now, trauma can also be used to describe the psychological consequences of the events that we just talked about. And traumatic stress responses are sometimes captured under the umbrella of post-traumatic stress disorder. That would probably be the category of mental illness that is most familiar to people, given its common use in the public realm. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of key features of post-traumatic stress disorder. One involves avoidance of situations or settings that are reminders of the traumatic events. Another is re-experiencing the events even after they have stopped, and that might take the form of nightmares or flashbacks. And lastly, there can be a sense of hypervigilance or being on edge, kind of monitoring one's surroundings. And these kind of three clusters generally happen in the context of a general mood or emotional disturbance that can influence how we think and how we feel going throughout our daily lives.
But does everyone experience post-traumatic stress disorder from trauma?
Anywhere between like 10 to 30% of people who experience a bona fide traumatic event might develop PTSD. Another subset might develop what we call an acute stress reaction, so a psychological injury that is more time-limited in nature. And the fact of the matter is a lot of people who experience traumatic stress, a lot of people who experience these types of events actually do okay. Their natural coping mechanisms and social support networks provide what the individual needs to weather that storm.
Are we as a community experiencing trauma after what happened on our campus on June 28th?
It's not a straightforward answer. There is a framework in the literature called collective trauma. And this is the idea that rather than individuals, which we tend to focus on in clinical psychology and psychiatry, communities can actually be exposed to trauma. This might include communities that have experienced events associated with racism. This could include disasters, such as, say, the city of Manhattan being collectively traumatized after 9/11, or a community, say Louisiana, being collectively traumatized after Hurricane Katrina. So there is some thinking out there that a community can bear some type of sociological weight and some collective injury that corresponds to an event. The fact of the matter remains, at the individual level, and community being comprised of many individuals forming a group, at the individual level, some people will be probably significantly affected by the event, especially those who were most proximal or closest to the actual event itself, or closest to the individuals who were affected. Other individuals will not feel traumatized, and that's okay as well. There's heterogeneity in response to stress always. It depends on a number of interacting factors, including how people were doing beforehand. And so there is this collective event that has happened that we might conceptualize as trauma, and at the individual levels, some people will be struggling significantly, some people moderately, and some people will not be struggling at all.
What informs the way that we react or how it impacts us?
So there are several types of protective factor or buffering factors that influence how we respond to a stressful event. This is actually one of the biggest questions in mental health research. Why do some events or some situations or some environments affect certain people more than others? One idea is that there is a genetic susceptibility. So some people are more environmentally susceptible to environmental influence, whether it's stress or whether it's a positive, enriching environment. Another factor that I really want to drive home for our conversation today refers to the social context in which an individual finds themselves. And that could be described on a continuum of social support. How many positive, supportive, healthy, and close relationships does a person have to leverage in times of stress, adversity, or trauma? I mentioned social support. There's another construct called collective efficacy of a community. How effective does the community feel together? Another construct that I'm really into right now is belonging. Do I feel like I belong to the environment in which I find myself, whether it's with a family, with a peer group, with educators and other kind of formalized relationships, friends at work, neighbors, that kind of thing. And so there's quite compelling evidence to suggest that following a traumatic event or following a significant stress, those people who have better relationships do significantly better in terms of their mental health.
What about our past experience? What if we've had traumatic events or been in high stress situations in our lives previously?
There is absolutely evidence to suggest that folks who have had past experiences of trauma or who have had past episodes or challenges with mental illness may be more susceptible to future trauma or stressors. This hypothesis is called the stress sensitization hypothesis, and that is, if we experience trauma or adversity in our early life, our nervous system is kind of getting tuned up to be more susceptible to future threat. And you can imagine from an evolutionary perspective, that might actually be advantageous. If we learn in our early life that the world is risky or dangerous, then we might be in a situation characterized by threat. So in the future, in order to survive, we might need to have our vigilance a little bit higher. And so those folks might actually have a heightened stress response in the case of future traumas. And the reason is survival, essentially. The traumatic stress response is essentially a survival mechanism. It can be overgeneralized, and of course, it's very distressing for people. Things like avoiding potentially triggering situations or re-experiencing the event in order to maintain a sense of vigilance or hyperarousal, those things are suggested to enhance our survival, but of course they convey tremendous suffering for the individual who's experiencing a traumatic stress response.
How do we know if we are traumatized by an event, by an experience, by an exposure to something?
It's not an easy thing to notice at first. In fact, a very common trajectory of response following a traumatic event is that an individual might honestly do a self appraisal and notice that they're feeling okay. I feel kind of all right now. I'm hearing everybody telling me that this is an important thing, so I'm checking in on myself. And they might notice some people around them who are struggling, and they try to be a source of support. And then down the road, maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, they find themselves getting a little bit irritable, or maybe a little more moody or sad or depressed, or find that they're not enjoying things that they used to enjoy, or maybe they're finding that they're a little bit more on edge than they used to. So it can be very insidious. That is, we don't know what's happening until it's really there. So my suggestion would be take a proactive approach, talk to a close friend, a loved one, a family member, a peer or a colleague about how they're doing. And also, you don't need to be in crisis to see a mental health practitioner. You can do that proactively, and there are resources that have been disseminated by the university in order to get ahead of some challenges that might be coming down the line.
Yes. And we're going to share those links in our show notes as well. What about if someone's saying, hey, I was close to this danger or perceived danger, and I am feeling okay, and everybody else doesn't seem okay? What's wrong with me that it's not affecting me? What would you like people to know about that?
Not everybody responds to a stressor in the same way. And if somebody is not feeling, quote unquote, traumatized, whatever their personal working definition of that is, if somebody is feeling fine, if somebody actually might be feeling quite strong, or they might have a renewed sense of community or belonging or meaning in life, that's completely okay too. So some people are not really affected by particular events, and that represents a significant and sizable group of people. In fact, when we look at groups who have been exposed to similar traumatic stressors, there often is a sizable, if not the largest group of people who do not develop clinical symptoms. It doesn't mean that they're callous or they're unemotional or that they lack empathy. It just means that for whatever reasons, and we talked about some of these explanations before, they could be genetic, they can be environmental. For whatever reason, their stress response did not get activated in such a way that they're experiencing a traumatic syndrome in response to a particular stressor. I wanted to mention that there is another group that has been observed in the literature. There is some debate around its validity. However, I think I wanted to mention it anyway, and that's called post-traumatic growth. So there are some folks who experience potentially life-threatening or traumatic situations and end up developing a reinvigorated life or a deeper sense of meaning or purpose.
When does PTSD develop?
If it's within 30 days, we might call that an acute stress response. After 30 days, we'd call that a post-traumatic stress disorder if those symptoms have been there for longer than 30 days. However, sometimes folks will not display any symptoms for, it could be weeks, even months, maybe 6 months or a year even. And then they develop symptoms later that are characteristic of PTSD, and we call that a sleeper effect. So everything seems fine, and then maybe something else happens, a small stressor, and then this thing that has been, riding within us incognito comes out.
What are the signs that someone around us may be struggling?
It can be really challenging to detect traumatic stress symptoms in someone around us. Part of that is due to the fact that one of the cardinal features of something like PTSD is avoidance. If we observe people in our professional circles kind of dropping off, maybe not coming to campus anymore, opting for a larger quantity of online work or exclusively online work, we might want to check in with that person, because when something like this happens, our natural inclination, or one of the natural inclinations, is to avoid the thing that reminds us of that or potential threat in the future. Another feature can be irritability. So sometimes anxiety or even depression can mask itself as irritability. And when we think about the fight or flight response, and that's a response that's activated in response to threat, we might generalize or overlearn this type of safety behavior and end up displacing some of that onto our peers or colleagues. So if things are getting a little bit heated when working with someone or working in part of a team, we might want to pause, put the issue at hand on the shelf for a little bit, and just do a bit of a check-in on how everybody's doing in terms of their levels of stress.
How do we check in? How do we be a supportive friend or colleague without being intrusive?
I don't know that there's necessarily one way to do this, and I think it will also differ as a function of the professional relationship. So, for example, I have colleagues who are my friends at work where, because of the closeness of our relationship, it would absolutely not be offside for me to say, hey, how are you doing with everything that happened on campus in the last few weeks? I just know that because of our friendship. Though there will be other relationships, perhaps more formal relationships, that are also characterized by a dimension of power, whether it's an administrator, a chair, or somebody who is effectively another person's boss. Those conversations might happen at the group level, and it can be an acknowledgement of what's happened, and creating a space and a time within a meeting to say, hey, I'm just taking the moment to acknowledge the stress that everyone's been through in the last few weeks. This is a place where we can talk about it. And I'd just like to invite everyone here to take a moment to either reflect in silence or contribute how they've been doing. Disclosure can go a long way in this type of scenario.
Oh, what do you
So
mean?
if a person in a position of authority is asking people who are more or less in subordinate positions to disclose vulnerabilities, that might not necessarily be a great look. But if there is a sense of intimacy and closeness within a team, and an administrator or an authority figure might disclose reasonably that it's been a challenging time for them as well, without going into unnecessary or gratuitous details, that's something that can work to get the ball rolling. I think we should normalize psychotherapy or seeking mental health services, not only at this moment in our campus's history, but always. We have fantastic resources and counseling services on campus, and we should all feel comfortable and not stigmatized in accessing those supports.
So we're all affected in different ways. How do you think that we as a community can heal and move forward?
When we're faced with a collective problem, focusing more attention on the problem only begets more of that problem. An example in history would be something like the war on drugs, or policies and programs in the 90s that focused on reducing substance use in young people. And inadvertently, those programs actually increased substance use. There's some interesting examples and anecdotes of that happening. So rather than focusing on trauma exclusively, I think there is room and opportunity to focus on belonging, togetherness, and cohesion within the campus community, particularly for our 2S LGBTQ plus members of the community who have been particularly targeted in the recent events. So that is by focusing on safe spaces, togetherness, belonging, community relationships, and moving our University of Waterloo relationships towards our collective goals, rather than exclusively away from trauma, we stand to do a lot of good. Now, that being said, we can't completely not talk about trauma and things that have happened. One of the key features of trauma-informed psychotherapy is that we speak the unspeakable. We talk about what happened without avoiding it.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance, and the relative emphasis on capital T trauma versus relationships and belonging might differ as a function of the level at which that messaging is taking place. So the type of narrative that should happen or could happen from upper level administration is not going to be the same conversation that an individual would have one-on-one in a session of psychotherapy, nor should it be. So I think there are two sides to this coin. Both are important. And by holding it with open hands and moving towards a sense of safety and community togetherness and belonging, I think we're poised to do a lot of good in a situation that isn't.
What other points would you like to make before we close today?
As we move towards our collective healing, I think it's important to remember that the opposite of mental illness or the opposite of a traumatic stress response isn't simply mental health. It's belonging, it's togetherness, and it's community. That is one of the things that our mental health problems try to do for us is to isolate. They try to get us into a corner or try to get us away from community. And that's because they're survival mechanisms. You know, a PTSD response is a survival mechanism that tries to ensure that the individual lives in the future. And if the world has been suggested to be threatening, whether it's through a natural disaster or through an attack, then the response is to isolate the individual to avoid future negative circumstances. So as we move towards our healing, we're not simply thinking about the absence of threat on campus. I think we need to be thinking about the presence of belonging and togetherness.
This attack happened right near the end of Pride Month, where there were many activations to show belonging and being welcome. Is that significant?
I think it's extremely significant. I think we need to double down on our support and our investment in diversity initiatives on campus, especially the 2S LGBTQ plus community, gender studies in light of this particular attack. And this is an everybody issue. And I think it is important to remember the context in which they happened. And so moving forward, I think increased investment, both in terms of economic capital and social capital. So our efforts in supporting all diversity on campus and the communities that bring folks together is really important.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise and for everything that you're doing to help the members of our community.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. You'll find our archive of full episodes on the University of Waterloo website. Select interviews are on the university's YouTube channel. Just look for our playlist there. Please join Brandon Sweet and me for new episodes. And don't forget to tell your Waterloo connections about us.